welcome to Albany State University's 7th annual Women's Studies Symposium. Our theme this year is Voices of the Voiceless. I am Dr. Geneva Diamond of the English department here at ASU, and I'll be Mistress of Ceremonies for the day. We will get into our first panel with Dr. Primo Vincent in just a moment, but Dr. Hill, who is the chair of the English department, is going to give our official welcome. Dr. Hill?
Good morning. It is my esteemed pleasure to welcome you to the 7th Annual Women's Symposium here at Albany State University. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students in the Department of English, Modern Languages, and Mass Communication, the College of Arts and Humanities, headed by Dr. Marcia Hood, and of course the university with our interim president, Dr. Ott Dunning, I bring you greetings for this very special symposium. Although our audience does not bespeak the importance of it, I want to impress upon you that this is Women's History Month, and that as we look at the globe, there are still continuing issues that we need to address as a society to ensure that women are placed in the important light that they should be placed in. We have only to look at what's happening in social media, even life on college campuses, Penn State University being the most recent example, to see that we are a long way from where we should be. So it's, again, my pleasure to welcome you, and I hope that you have an enjoyable symposium. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Adriana, Primo Vincent, and I'm going to introduce the first speakers of the day. Mrs. Silky Dilly is not here yet, so I'm going to introduce the two other presenters, and at the end, we go to the questions. The first one is Derek Hankinson. He is presenting Feminist Criticism and Heritage in Edwidge, Dancat, Breath, Eyes, Memory, and then he's an English major, and then the next one is a social major that she's going to present Joy Reading, an investigation into breastfeeding, patterns of African-American women living in rural counties in Georgia. Please welcome them.
Good morning. Today I will be presenting a topic on feminist criticism in Dandicat's Breath, Eyes, Memory in reference to conflicting traditions within Haitian and American culture. Historically, feminist criticism is one of the most debatable areas of focus in literary form. The subjectivity in theory can aid an individual mold their craft of writing. In addition, this area of focus allots room for various views of interpretation to justify the values of women. When referring to this literary form, there must be recognition of key concepts of debate that act as undercurrent symbols to illuminate how this area of study is in fact separate and holds an authoritative standpoint within the society of literature. There are various texts to provide example of this, and one text to portray this vision of completeness through its application of the thematic statements is the text Breath, Eyes, Memory by Edwidge Danticat. Throughout this text, there are instances to enlighten the reader about the nature of women through the use of key concepts such as motherhood. Such concepts create debate in the area of conflict. This can vary. In some instances, the conflict is internal or external, and in other instances, it is the difference in class or culture. Although motherhood can be viewed or expressed as an essential theme throughout the text, the area of significant analysis lies in how the acts of motherhood cause conflict between the traditions of Haitian and American culture. The text provides various instances to illuminate the cultural clash between two cultures. One of the instances to catch the attention of the reader lies in the conflict of class differences. "What do you think of Mark?" she asks, quickly changing the subject. "I think he's smart. Helped me a lot getting you here," she said, even though he did not like the way I went about it. In Haiti, it would not be possible for someone like Mark to love someone like me. He is from a very upstanding family. His grandfather was a Frenchman. In this instance, Dandikit sheds light on the fact that within societal structures there is an existence of barriers. In some cases, these barriers act as a veil to keep individuals from experiencing the healthy relationship. Here it is mentioned that Mark and Martini can't experience the ideal relationship because of separate rankings in social status. Mark holds the title of a Frenchman, which is the upstanding status, while Martine holds the title of working class, which is of lesser value when referring to the rankings in social orders. The concept of social status is a pivotal role in the text, and when referring to motherhood, the significance lies in how she points out the value in the relationship between herself and Mark. Martine states the relationship would not be possible in their home country of Haiti. This is important due to the reference made toward the values of a relationship. She teaches her daughter to locate someone with social ranking when entering into a relationship. This is an essential method of practice because it teaches that as a mother, there should be an existence of proper practices that will teach an individual to have value in themselves and to marry someone with social rank. In addition, these methods of practice illustrate how the traditions of Haitian culture differs from that of American culture by means of there being an impossibility to marry someone of higher social class in Haiti, yet in America such practices are quite possible. Another instance to demonstrate how the acts of motherhood portray the differences in Haitian and American culture is during the acts of practice to engage in what the mother believes are the proper preparations for sex. When I was a girl, my mother used to test to see if we were virgins. She would put her finger in our very private parts to see if it would go inside. Your tanty auntie hated it. She used to scream like a pig in a slaughterhouse. The way my mother was raised, a mother is supposed to do that to her daughter until the daughter is married. It is her responsibility to keep her pure. In this instance, Martini explains her justification in the act of being viewed as molestation and abuse of parental rights. There is a fine line between what is right and what is wrong, and the beliefs and traditions in this case can be the reasoning behind the acts of ill will. It can be interpreted that the mother-daughter relationship is one that is fueled by the obedience of the daughter to the mother, and this is unique and valuable, and a valuable cause. The saddening truth behind such is the acts that come with that responsibility. The mother in this case is doing what she believes is right. Her Haitian tradition has implemented what the culture deems as just acts of purification. The mother believes what she is doing is preserving her daughter and keeping her daughter to keep her chastity before she is married. The ironic interpretation of these acts is although physically her virginity is being preserved, the act of entering into the private area of a young woman in reality takes her virginity away piece by piece. She is undergoing unjust acts of molestation. It can be interpreted that the mother is by all means in the right state of mind to believe the traditions she has been accustomed to because she has had the same occurrences happen to her as well. In a sense, this justifies her acts, yet there must be a consideration of her ignorance to what is deemed love in this instance. Does she truly love her daughter because she violates her daughter and enacts upon this period of physical abuse, or does she love her daughter and will stop what has happened to her and go against the principles and traditions of the culture they are accustomed to? The love that she believes to be justified is the love of her tradition beyond the love of her daughter. The acts she participates in make it clear to the reader that she loves her traditions more than her daughter. These principles are what she deems as the way to love her daughter, that through the acts of love of her traditions and principles, she will conduct these practices and demonstrate that her love is present. This act of love illustrates how the belief in one way of life may hold others to believe that their judgment is clouded. The reality is the mother can view directly that the daughter in this case will be uncomfortable. The daughter will enact upon instances of resistance and This will be crying or screaming. The acts were portrayed by Dandikit to illuminate how there is a visible difference in the beliefs and traditions of Haitian and American cultures. In essence, the mother and daughter relationship is highly debatable subjectivity when referring to the presence of motherhood in literary studies. In reference to the feminist perspective, there must be a consideration of how the internal conflict must be present in the mother as well as the daughter. The mother, like the daughter, is victim of the values that are tradition for the Haitian people. The mother believes she is protecting and preserving the chastity of her daughter by conducting such acts. The daughter, on the other hand, is being taken advantage of the same traditions that, scared her mother. The daughter-mother relationship may be affected due to this cause. The daughter may grow up feeling uncomfortable with sexual intercourse. If married, the marriage may be hindered. In this case, this was the situation for Sophie. In reality, the daughter may come to resent her mother when the resentment should be preserved for the tradition and principles that have been designed for both. It is evident there are two victims. The power lies in how one will decide to end the process and start anew. There must be a consideration of this change in this instance. The difference between American and Haitian customs is a thematic point of view that is present throughout the text. In addition, the methods portrayed by the author create the conflict that deserves periods of analysis. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Joy Reddy. I am a junior here at Albany State University, majoring in social work. And I did my research on an investigation into breastfeeding patterns of African American women living in rural counties in Georgia. And this research was funded by the Title III Center for Undergraduate Research program here. What is breastfeeding? To feed infant or young children from the female breast. Why is it important? Breastfeeding, if done early and consistently, may lead to improved health, economic, and societal well-being of mother and child. The benefits for mommy. It burns calories and helps mom to return to her pre-pregnancy weight. It helps lessen postpartum bleeding and return uterus to its normal size. It reduces the risk of developing type 2 diabetes as well as ovarian and breast cancers. And also, if you was to have a little girl and you chose to breastfeed her, it decreases her chances as well as far as endometriosis, cervical, and breast cancer. Also help cutting down the obesity rate in the mother and child. The benefits for baby. It helps protect baby from asthma. If asthma was to run in a person's family, if they chose to breastfeed, it decreases their child of having asthma by choosing to breastfeed. It's easier for the baby to digest the breast milk rather than formula because formula is made up of a lot of chemicals. As for breast milk, is made directly for the mother and it's natural and it's fulfilled with a lot of antibodies and natural laxatives that help digest the milk within the baby digestive system. It contains growth factors that ensure the best development of your baby's organs. What that means is that if you chose to breastfeed, it helps the baby to meet their milestones faster than if they were on formula. It protects the baby from becoming an overweight child. What that means is that if you choose to breastfeed your baby, it decreases your baby's chances of being obese because, like I said, the milk is easily digested, meaning that if they was to be on formula, it would be hard for them to digest, which allows them to be constipated. They'll have a lot of acid reflux, and it'll cause a lot of problems with the child. The problem is that we were seeing that low breastfeeding rates were in the African American communities. And why is this important? Because in the African American community, there are a lot of diseases and illnesses that combat us. So we were trying to figure out how can we come up with a plan to help mother and child during pregnancy and after pregnancy. And we felt that if we was to help moms see the benefits of breastfeeding, that can decrease their chances of those illnesses. Unfortunately, we found in earlier times, the images that was chosen to educate mothers on breastfeeding they could not relate to them because they resembled Caucasian mothers or Hispanic mothers. There were not a lot of images to help African American mothers, and we know that images play a lot of influential part when it comes to education, because if you send this Caucasian or Hispanic mom breastfeeding, you wouldn't believe that you can do it because she doesn't look like you. So African American women are choosing not to breastfeed because of common barrier. Some of the barriers were pain, embarrassment with public nursing, going back to work, concern about social life with breastfeeding, and just not wanting to. The literature that was chosen to educate mothers on breastfeeding could actually misrepresent them. Literature and images in the past does not relate to women of African American descent. There were more posters, books, magazines featuring Caucasian women breastfeeding as it seemed to be the normal. And these are some of the pictures that was pulled from the internet. And the bottom right picture of the baby, that is actually the books that are located in the WIC office, which is the Women, Infant, and Children supplementary program that's located at the health department. These were books that was found that we was given to our mothers, and some of our mothers would say, these babies don't look like my babies, so why should I use these books? These are also images that help show breastfeeding in the community. If you look at the African American mother, she's actually sitting on the porch. It doesn't look comfortable. The picture looks dreary, kind of sad, versus the picture on the picture with the mom breastfeeding on Sesame Street. She's a Caucasian mother who's breastfeeding, and it seemed to be the norm. It was, they didn't try to hide it. Solutions. What we know is that there is a gap between African American women not choosing to breastfeed their babies and women of other races choosing to breastfeed their babies. There are many reasons for them not doing it, and it's starting with the lack of support. I don't know if y'all familiar with the case with the mother who was breastfeeding at the college graduation or college. Are you familiar with that? It was a lot of bad things said about that. When I saw that image, I felt like, oh, she's doing a great thing for her baby. She's helping her baby decrease the chances of cancer. She's cutting down on obesity. She's helping the community. She's saving the world. That's how I felt. But everybody felt like it was so wrong because she was sitting here breastfeeding her baby. You couldn't actually see her breast, but you knew what she was doing. But on the other end, they also compared it to a picture of Rihanna on the red carpet, half naked, and everybody favored that picture. But that just shows you how much, strife goes into mothers who actually choose to breastfeed their babies in public. I don't feel like it's a problem because it's not a taboo. She's actually doing something for her baby. Not only for her baby, she's doing something for herself. Not for herself, but also the community, because if she's breastfeeding her baby, she helping to protect her baby immune system. So if we protect one person's immune system, just think how many people they can actually save. One less sick child can actually stop a lot of diseases and illnesses from going around. So if you do see a mother who's breastfeeding, don't look at the negative part about it. Just look at the positive. She's helping her baby. She cares enough to bond with her baby. Not only that, she's helping cut down all these diseases and illnesses that can be passed from child to child. The end.
I would like to thank you, Joy and Derek, for the wonderful presentation. And I would like to introduce our next presenter, Mrs. Silky Dilly. She is Executive Director of Liberty House of Albany. And for the ones who don't know, Liberty House of Albany was established in 1981. It is a nonprofit agency in Doty County that provides comprehensive service for domestic violence victims, their children, families, and friends. Please welcome Mrs. Silky Dilly.
Okay. Good morning. We're just hearing all sorts of wonderful things about women. Seems like we have a long way to go to overcome a lot of myths and stories about what we should or should not be doing, and the criticism that we get from the general population, even in the 2000s. Liberty House, as you heard, is the domestic violence shelter program, and services and emergency shelter, and we're located in Dougherty County. We cover 17 counties in southwest Georgia. Before I start my presentation, I want you to know that we have an intern, Miss Brittany Fuse from ASU, and she is responsible for putting this presentation together for me. So give her a hand, please, because it's really good. Domestic violence. Defining domestic violence. Domestic violence is a pattern of behaviors used by one person in a relationship to gain power and control over another. So when we think about domestic violence, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with just the physical violence, but it's an overall holistic consideration of the physical, emotional, psychological abuse that happens when one person has more power and control over another. You know, we see that in society as a whole, but when we talk about domestic violence, it's in terms of intimate relationships. And this includes, as I said, various types of violence: physical, sexual, economic, verbal, psychological. Many acts of domestic violence, like psychological or emotional abuse, are not violations of legal statutes. So this means that when someone is exercising power and control, this is where that begins. That control is reinforced by acts or threats of physical or sexual abuse. The state of Georgia defines family violence as the occurrence of one or more of the following acts between specific parties: past or present spouses, persons who are parents of the same child, parent and children or child, step-parents and children, foster parents, and other persons. And that includes roommate situations. So I know that on the college campus, if you're in a dorm, you may have a roommate, and if there's an altercation between you and your roommate, we also consider that as domestic violence, even though you're not necessarily intimate partners. Specific acts include any felony, a battery, a simple assault, stalking. Stalking is one of those things that we probably see a lot more on college campuses. And then criminal damage to property, unlawful restraint, and criminal trespass. So those are a lot of acts that can happen, unfortunately, when we're talking about domestic violence. A lot of the acts that occur between intimate partners are not necessarily felonies. There are very few that are considered felonies. They're misdemeanors, which is why we see a lot of abusers back out in the streets momentarily after there's been an act of violence. The law specifically excludes reasonable discipline administered by a parent to a child when we're talking about parent-child domestic violence occurrences. DFACS and Child Protective Services has a list of standards about what is appropriate, and that varies from state to state. Georgia is one of those states where disciplining a child does include hitting and spanking, and I have severe issues with that because I am not from the state of Georgia, and there are other states in our nation that protects children from being physically abused. I'm sure that there are a lot of considerations in terms of ethnicity and race when we talk about disciplining children. So that might be a topic for another time. Defining domestic violence. This is the power and control wheel that lots of domestic violence advocates and shelters use in describing what that might look like. Because when we say domestic violence, not everyone that we work with understands what that really means. So using coercion and threats, and oftentimes a lot of those threats are, if you do this, I'll kill you, or I'm going to kill myself, or I'm going to hurt your children, or I'm going to hurt a family member, or just merely the threat of saying, you know what, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to leave this relationship. Intimidation, and making her afraid by the way someone looks at you, by the actions. Some of those things might be abusing pets, throwing things, talking about past acts of violence so that the person is intimidated and is afraid in that relationship. Using emotional abuse, putting people down, verbal abuse, name calling, making them feel bad about themselves, making her think that she's crazy, playing mind games. Some of the things that come to mind when we talk about the victims that we work with. They do think that they're crazy because what he's done, and he's talked to the family member, he's talked to her friends and said, you know what, she's acting really bizarre. She thinks I'm having an affair. She thinks I have another girlfriend. She's imagining things. And the more he talks about this, and I'm saying he only because generally abusers are men, although we understand and know that not all men are abusers and that there are women that are abusers as well. So once he's done this with family members and friends, of course, when she starts reporting things that are happening, they've already got this in their head that, wow, you know, she's a loose cannon, she's not well, she's mentally ill. Using isolation, that's something that we see quite frequently is the women that we work with have been isolated from family and friends. He doesn't allow her to have friends. Everywhere she goes, he has to be with her. He only wants her to be with him and no one else. So that's when we think about using isolation. Over a period of time, then, that person is indeed isolated. She doesn't have any friends. She's not allowed to go to work. Minimizing or denying and blaming, making light of the abuse. A lot of people who are abusive feel that it is their right to do so. Many years ago, before the women's rights movement, which really started up around the 70s, because up until 1971, there really weren't very many shelters, if any at all. If I recall correctly, the first was in New England. There were no shelters, and the movement really was much about an underground movement of women helping other women to stay safe, leave abusive relationships, and stay in hiding, which is certainly not the ideal. Using children, of course, threats of, I'm going to call defects on you, I'm going to take your children if they're married and he wants to get divorced, he's going to keep her from having those children or having any access to those children. And then using male privilege, treating her like she's a servant. And back in the day, how many of you heard the expression, I'm drawing a blank right now. There was a law that allowed your husband or your partner to beat you as long as whatever it was that he used was only as thick as his thumb. The rule of thumb, thank you. Yeah, and you know, when we think about male privilege, there's still a lot of male privilege, a belief of male privilege. So men will do what they will do simply because they believe they can. Then we go back to another wheel, which is a nonviolence wheel, which shows you healthy relationships, essentially, and equality, negotiation and fairness, non-threatening behavior, respect, trust and support, honesty and accountability, responsible parenting, shared responsibility, and economic partnership. And I think this is something that not just victims of domestic violence are striving for, but I think it's a human condition. We're all wanting equality. When we talk about domestic violence and defining how that cycle works, I have my own thoughts about this. This concept of the cycle of violence, in a lot of relationships, this is kind of what it looks like. When you first get with someone, when you start dating somebody, you are all on your best behavior. Everybody's trying to put their best foot forward. And so that kind of looks like that honeymoon phase where everybody's being nice and sweet. And then suddenly things start to change. There's either verbal abuse or criticism, and we call that the tension building phase, where you start to think that, wow, I don't know, maybe this relationship isn't for me, and it starts to become abusive, and you're thinking that maybe that you've done something wrong. And then that escalates. Over time, that might escalate into a physical altercation. And then, of course, comes the apology, and I'm so sorry, I promise never to do that again. And then we're back in that honeymoon phase where he's bringing flowers. For many women in an abusive relationship, this is kind of a linear line rather than a circle. These things are happening on a constant daily basis. She's walking on eggshells. She doesn't know what's going to happen next. All she knows is that something is going to happen. And what happens in a lot of these relationships where it's linear rather than circular, a lot of the women will just provoke as best they can so that they can get that violent phase over and done with and get right back to the honeymoon, however small in time span that might be. So these things could happen within a day. They could happen maybe once or twice a year, or maybe they're just happening on a monthly basis. But it varies from case to case. This is not something that we see in every single case of victims that we work with. Common reactions to what happens in these relationships is, of course, trauma and shock, denial. A lot of the women that we work with, they deny or minimize the kind of violence that they're experiencing. And why not? Because they're in shock that it even happened, because this is not what they signed up for. Nobody goes into a relationship thinking that I'm going to be abused and I'm going to like it. And that's part of what happens also in the mindset of abusers who believe that, well, she likes this. This is okay. She stays because she likes it. The stress, crisis, they're in constant crisis mode. Anger, sadness, confusion, and then all the normal kinds of stressors that we all have on a daily basis. All of those things wrapped into one. You can imagine perhaps what happens to the human body when a person is under all of this kind of stress. So aside from why we have them in our offices, it's not just all about the black eyes and the bruises. 40% of the women that we see have also been sexually abused. 62 have been punched or kicked. 60% have been strangled. And in the past, people would refer to this as choking. I want to stress the difference. When someone puts their hands around your neck, they're putting their hands around your neck because the ultimate end of that is death. So my thinking and our thinking as advocates for victims of sexual assault and domestic violence, a lot of our women say, oh, well, he put his hands around my throat, but he didn't choke me. But that's strangulation. And just this past year, there's been a new law, and anytime anyone puts their hand around someone's neck, that now has become a felony rather than just a misdemeanor. And it takes less than the amount of pressure to shake someone's hand to strangle someone to the point where they pass out. So think about that. When you turn a doorknob, that's when you shake someone's hand. That's not a whole lot of pressure. And you can do a whole lot of damage. There's a whole lot of physical damage that can occur that you might not be able to see when you have strangled somebody to the point where they pass out. And women have died and gotten other brain injuries due to the result of somebody putting their hands around their neck. 59% have been abused during pregnancy. Pregnancy seems to be a catalyst for increased violence. 34% have been threatened with a weapon. 65% have been abused in front of their children. And then that brings us to a whole nother level in terms of cruelty to children charges that can be filed. And sometimes those charges are filed against the victims as well, simply by the fact that they're with somebody, and now we're re-victimizing the victim all over again. Because somehow it must be her fault that she's being abused and that she has children with her abuser. 40% have kept have been kept from getting or maintaining a job. 33% have heard you'll never see your kids again, and she believes this when he says it. 60% have heard no one will ever want you, and she believes that. 55% have heard you can't make it without me. And in cases where there is isolation, where there is financial abuse, where they're not allowed to work, again, she believes that because he is her sole support. The Georgia Crime Victim Bill of Rights is that to provide victims of crime with fundamental services and notification of case status throughout all phases of the criminal justice system. A lot of victims of domestic violence don't understand the criminal process. And as part of our job in this community and all the communities when we work with victims, we provide them with their Bill of Rights and the information that they need when there is prosecution. And all victims are entitled to notification when the accused is arrested, when he's released from custody. You would be amazed at how often this doesn't occur. I want to move on to the myths and facts, because a lot of this stuff you can look at online as well. I would know a battered woman if I saw one. How many of you do you think that you would know? So if you look at these pictures, can you pick out the victim of domestic violence? 1 in 3 women are victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. Look around the room, how many women are in here? Would you know which one to pick out? Probably not. Domestic violence is a problem for all populations of women and men. It knows no race, religion, or economic status. She must be doing something to provoke him. Violence is a choice. There is nothing that anyone can do in an intimate relationship that offers the other one the opportunity to be abusive. We all have choices, and violence is a choice. Domestic violence is never the victim's fault. The batterer's behavior is a choice. A victim will be safer after she presses charges. What we know about that is that when a victim presses charges or makes any attempt to escape the relationship, she increases her chances of being killed in this relationship by 75%. The victim is his or her own expert. If she feels like it's in her best interest to not press charges, she's probably right. Because what happens is that it escalates the violence or can escalate the violence. So oftentimes the women that we work with, we want to empower them to make the decision about when it's safe to leave if they're still in that relationship, and then offer them safety and safety planning so that she can make her escape in the best possible way to reduce her chances of becoming a homicide victim. Batterers are out of control when they become violent. I really like this because batterers are never out of control. The only people that are probably out of control in these scenarios are the women or the victims. Batterers are very much in control of their violence. They are not often violent to anyone but their partner. This is just an isolated incident. While the act of physical violence may be an isolated incident, it is important to consider the totality of the circumstances. We work with a lot of women who, when it becomes physical, certainly don't see the degree of abusive behaviors that were occurring prior to that violence. It might be years before he actually becomes physically violent, but you have to consider, again, the totality of the actions that have been taking place in that relationship. If an authority figure tells him to stop, he will. How many of you believe that might be true? Battering is about power and control over the victim. He may begin to use more of the non-criminal tactics. One of the things that have happened in the last probably 7 years is the establishment of batterer intervention programs. The recidivism for the men who go through the batterer intervention programs, and we have one here in Dougherty County called Judicial Alternatives of Georgia. They offer batterer intervention programs. Imagine a whole room full of batterers sitting around having to talk about so that they can understand what they've done, their methods of abuse. And then getting instruction on the laws that relate to domestic violence and what the law looks for in terms of victim abuse and what her injuries might look like if somebody shows up, what's a chargeable offense, what's not. And now they've learned that, they can't leave marks, because if law enforcement shows up and he's beaten her about her head and perhaps, punched her in her stomach or in her kidneys, you're not going to see much evidence. You're not going to see much in the way of injuries at all, at least not for a day or two. If she's already terrified, she's not going to talk. She's not going to say anything. Her injuries on her head, if he only hit her with his hand, there's not much going to show up externally. So when the law shows up, police officer shows up, he can't determine who might have been the primary aggressor because we don't see much in terms of injuries. So now we have a whole room full of guys that really understand how they can continue the abuse and not get arrested. So part of what we're responsible to do is educate everyone, people in the community and the women that we work with, about what domestic violence looks like and what these scenarios are all about. The next myth, domestic violence is caused by drug and alcohol use or abuse. While it certainly can exacerbate the situation, it's not what causes it. Batterers abuse because that's what they know. That's how they control victims of domestic violence. That's how they control their partners. They may have learned it because we understand that children who experience domestic violence, the males in those households, it increases their rate at 50% to also become abusers if they're in a household where they experience abuse. Because like all of us, no matter what kind of situation our family life has, we are learning how to communicate, how to behave in relationships. And we're going to learn good stuff, and then we're going to learn bad stuff. So substance abuse can worsen an already abusive situation, but the correlation, but no causal relationship. So how can you help? What can you do if you know someone is getting abused, or if you're the person that is getting abused? One thing to understand is that you're not going to be able to make decisions for the person who's being abused. The only person that you can make decisions for is yourself. So good, caring, compassionate attitude. If somebody shares information with you about their abuse, the only thing that you can do is certainly don't ask them, why did they stay? Because there are so many reasons why women stay. And oftentimes it just doesn't make sense to us, but it certainly makes sense to them. To reassure them that you're there for them and that you will help them in any way you can when they're ready. Offer them protection. Talk to them about options that are available. These are the kinds of things that we do. There are options. No one has to stay in these relationships, although sometimes the options may be coming into a shelter. And trust me, nobody wants to come into the shelter. You know, a shelter is not the Hilton, but our shelter is also not like the Mission. It is not the Salvation Army. Our shelter is just like a house with bedrooms and kitchens and looks like a normal house. It runs like a normal house. But you're having possibly to share a room. You're in a house with maybe 3 or 4 families, and communal living is difficult, especially with victims who've been traumatized and have a whole lot of other problems emotionally and psychologically. Offer emotional support and take their responses seriously. Take the information that they share with you seriously. And when we're talking about law enforcement, to be treated as a person rather than evidence or numbers. When we work with victims, the DA's office has victim witness staff. It's their job to assist victims of crimes, including domestic violence and sexual assault, to get through the system when there is prosecution. But their intent is not just about supporting that victim. They want to make sure that they have evidence. They want to make sure that they're able to prosecute this person. And our role in all of that is to provide support, emotional and psychological, and assist them in getting through the criminal process as well. But we're the only people that are not asking anything from them. We're there to be their sole support and provide them with as much advice and information as we can, so that on the other side of this, they come out and are able to become self-sufficient, self-sustaining, and free from violence. Proper and correct information is extremely important. Law enforcement has to obtain the right information in order to even press charges against anyone. And then to make sure that we keep the information up to date. We follow through with our clients to make sure that they are continually safe. Oftentimes women go back, but it doesn't keep us from staying in contact with them should they make a decision eventually to leave again. The faith community and domestic violence. Of course, religious teachings can either help or hinder when used to address domestic violence. It's important for religious and faith communities to minimize barriers for victims seeking help and maximize resources. This is a continual problem. We probably have 250 churches in this community. A lot of the women that we work with will come to us and say that they have sought other services, other help from their churches and from their pastors, and the faith community hasn't had enough education and training to actually be as responsive as they need to be. Counseling them, telling them that, the Bible says be subservient to your husband. And we can quote a whole lot of other Bible verses that will keep women in harm's way rather than to help them. So as part of the work that we do also, educating faith communities is part of what we do as well. Domestic violence in the workplace. Each year, approximately 9 million days of work are lost due to domestic violence. When women are abused and have physical injuries, they're certainly not wanting to go to work. Teen dating violence, all the same conditions pretty much apply, except for the fact that you're not living together. Or maybe you are, I don't know. But the same kinds of things are occurring. So in terms of what we do at our agency, we work with teenagers, we work with children, we work with adults to minimize what happens in relationships where violence is a daily occurrence. So understand that Liberty House is one of those options that can help women escape a life of violence or get you out of an unhealthy relationship. Thank you.
Again, I would like to thank you, Joy, Derek, and Mrs. Dilly for the wonderful presentation. And we have exactly 5 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, we're going to bring the mic for you.
I actually have a question for Joy. One of the things I know is that before formulas became widespread, upper-class women did not breastfeed. They hired wet nurses. And lower-class women then did breastfeed their own children. And I wonder if any of your research has shown whether or not those kind of social constructions of not only race, but class and hierarchy also come into play.
Because one of the things that we did take in consideration now, I'm going to talk about now, is that when African-American mothers are, breastfeeding, or if they choose to breastfeed, they don't breastfeed long because they have to go back to work. Just like the higher upper-class women, they hired a wet nurse because they was doing other things too. They just didn't have the time, and that also comes into play with the support as well.
So raise your hands if you have any questions for any of our presenters.
Also about breastfeeding, did you all find too that education was important even with the obstetrician or with the at the hospital once the baby was born, because I breastfed both of my children. And I noticed that, as you said, a lot of people said that, I have to go back to work, so I can't do this. But once they realized things like, well, you could breastfeed early in the morning, you could breastfeed when you come home from work, and that's at least 2 bottles right there that you don't have to make. Because I don't think people realize how expensive something like formula can be, and how tedious it can be to make a bottle, make it warm, do this, do that, when you literally could just lift your shirt and feed your child. So what are some things that you all found about like early education and letting young women know their options of when they can breastfeed?
Absolutely. That was actually one of my literature reviews in my research. But surprisingly, education was not the problem, because Phoebe here, because we did the surrounding counties here for Georgia, Phoebe has become a baby-friendly hospital. So what that means is that they actually pushing more breastfeeding. They're not sending moms home with pacifiers anymore or with formula. The formula that you receive in the room, that's what you take, if you decide to give your baby formula, that's all that you take home. But we do feel like the community as a whole needs to be educated on breastfeeding, because a lot of people like to see value. They like to see what the baby is actually getting. So with breastfeeding, they don't know. And we have some doctors that say, okay, well, the baby is underweight, not taking in consideration of genetics. Okay, the baby may be small because mom and dad may be small, versus putting them on formula so they can gain all of this weight. Like you said, you can breastfeed and work and go to school, because I've done it. I have a 4-year-old, and I started here when she was only 6 weeks old, so it can be done. I knew I was determined to do it. I knew that once I started school, only thing that I had to do was, after I nursed her, was have a plan. That's the success of the story of breastfeeding. You just got to have a plan. You can do it. If you want to work and go to school, you can. Only thing you have to do, like you say, is pump your breast, and store the milk. You have enough milk. So education is a major part of that.